I never thought a $50 fine would turn my quiet life in Vermont into a full-blown war with the most vindictive homeowner association president I'd ever met. But here we are, standing in the wreckage of what used to be a peaceful neighborhood. My name is Bradley Richardson, and I'm a civil engineer who moved to the small town of Stowe, Vermont 3 years ago. I bought a beautiful property on the edge of the Mountainside Estates development, a collection of about 40 homes nestled in the Green Mountains. The property came with something unique that I didn't fully appreciate at the time: a private bridge that crossed over Rocky Creek, connecting my land to the main cluster of homes in the development. The bridge had been built 20 years ago by the original landowner, my property's previous resident, who had some arrangement with the HOA that I never quite understood. When I bought the place, the realtor mentioned something about bridge access, but I was too excited about the workshop space and the mountain views to pay much attention to the fine print. Big mistake. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late January. I was in my workshop, working on a custom furniture piece for a client in Burlington, when I heard a sharp knock on my front door. I wiped the sawdust off my hands and opened it to find Brenda Whitmore, the HOA president, standing there with her arms crossed and a look on her face that could curdle milk. She was in her early 50s, with that particular haircut that seemed to be standard issue for women in her position. You know the one. Blonde highlights, aggressively layered, hovering somewhere between a bob and a pixie cut. She wore a puffy white jacket despite the relatively mild weather, and her lips were pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Mr. Richardson," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I'm here to inform you that you're in violation of HOA regulations." I blinked at her. "I'm sorry, what?" She thrust a paper at me. "Your front steps. You failed to salt them after the snowfall 3 days ago. That's a direct violation of Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws regarding winter maintenance and safety standards." I took the paper and looked at it. Sure enough, it was an official notice of violation with a $50 fine attached. I looked back at Brenda, then at my front steps. There had been maybe 2 inches of snow 3 days ago, and it had mostly melted. The steps were completely clear now. "The snow melted," I said. "The steps are fine." "That's not the point," Brenda said, her voice sharp. "The bylaws require that all walkways and steps be salted within 24 hours of snowfall exceeding 1 inch. You failed to do so. The fine stands." "I don't remember agreeing to these bylaws," I said, flipping through the violation notice. Brenda's expression grew even more severe, if that was possible. "Your property falls within the Mountainside Estates boundary. All properties within the boundary are subject to HOA regulations. This was disclosed in your purchase agreement." I vaguely remembered something about that, buried in the mountain of paperwork I'd signed 3 years ago. At the time, the HOA had seemed pretty hands-off. I'd paid my modest annual dues and never heard from anyone. I should have known it was too good to last. "Fine," I said, mostly because I wanted her off my porch. "I'll pay the $50. Is there anything else?" Brenda's eyes narrowed slightly. "Just see that you comply with the regulations going forward, Mr. Richardson. We take neighborhood safety very seriously." She turned and walked back down my driveway, and I watched her go with a sense of unease I couldn't quite shake. Something about the way she'd said that last part felt like a threat. I paid the fine online that afternoon and forgot about it, or tried to. But Brenda apparently hadn't forgotten about me. 2 weeks later, I got another violation notice. This time, it was for having my trash bins visible from the street. They were supposed to be stored out of sight except on trash collection days. The fine was $75. A week after that, another notice. My mailbox post needed repainting. $100. Then my lawn ornament, a small metal sculpture I'd made myself, was declared non-conforming to neighborhood aesthetic standards. $150. The fines kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. By mid-March, I'd racked up over $800 in violations, most of them for things so minor that I couldn't believe they were real. I tried calling Brenda to discuss the situation, but she never returned my calls. I tried attending an HOA board meeting, but I was told that only residents within the main development cluster could participate in meetings. My property, apparently, was just barely outside that zone. That's when I started doing some research. I pulled out all my property documents and started reading them carefully, every single page. And that's when I discovered something interesting. The bridge. The bridge that connected my property to the rest of Mountainside Estates, crossing Rocky Creek, was entirely on my land. Both ends of it, the whole structure, all of it was within my property boundaries. The original owner had granted the HOA an easement for bridge access, but that easement had expired 5 years ago and was never renewed. When I bought the property, I inherited ownership of the bridge, but there was no mention of any obligation to maintain HOA access. I sat back in my chair and stared at the documents for a long time. Without that bridge, the only way to access about 30 of the 40 homes in Mountainside Estates was to take a detour that added nearly 45 minutes to the drive, looping way around the mountain on old logging roads that were barely maintained. The bridge cut that down to less than 5 minutes. I didn't want to be petty. I really didn't. But Brenda had pushed and pushed, and I was tired of being nickel and dimed for nonsense violations. So I called a lawyer. His name was Marcus Chen, and he had an office in downtown Stowe. He was a sharp guy in his 30s who specialized in property law. I showed him all my documents, explained the situation with the fines, and asked him about the bridge. Marcus read through everything carefully, then looked up at me with a slight grin. "Well, Mr. Richardson, it looks like you own that bridge free and clear. The easement expired and there's nothing in your deed requiring you to maintain access. If you wanted to, you could legally restrict usage." "What would that look like?" I asked. "You could gate it off, charge a toll, limit the hours it's available, or close it entirely for maintenance. It's your property." I thought about that for a long time. What if I just closed it for maintenance indefinitely? Marcus leaned back in his chair. "You'd need to provide proper notice to avoid any claims of malicious intent. But yes, if the bridge genuinely needs maintenance, or if you simply don't want to assume the liability of having people cross your property, you have every right to close it. Even though it would massively inconvenience the HOA, even then, they should have renewed the easement or negotiated terms with you when you bought the property. That's their oversight, not your problem." I left Marcus's office with a plan forming in my mind. I didn't implement it right away. I waited. I wanted to give Brenda one more chance to be reasonable, but then I got another violation notice in early April. This one was for $200 because I'd had a work trailer parked in my driveway for 3 days while I was working on a big project. The notice said that commercial vehicles weren't allowed to be parked overnight in residential areas. That was it. I was done. I called Marcus and told him to draft a formal notice. Then I hired a contractor to come out and inspect the bridge. It was actually in pretty good shape, but he found a few minor issues that could potentially need addressing. Loose boards, some weathering on the support posts, that kind of thing. Nothing urgent, but enough to justify a maintenance closure. On a Monday morning in mid-April, I had a gate installed at my end of the bridge with a large sign that read, "Private property. Bridge closed for maintenance. No trespassing. Then I sat back and waited for the explosion. It came about 4 hours later. My phone started ringing off the hook. I didn't answer. Then someone started pounding on my door. I looked through the window and saw Brenda, her face red with fury. Behind her were at least a dozen other residents, all looking varying degrees of angry and confused. I opened the door but kept the screen door latched. "Can I help you?" "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Brenda shouted. "You can't close that bridge." "I can, actually," I said calmly. "It's on my property and it needs maintenance. I've closed it for safety reasons." "You can't do this. We need that bridge. Do you have any idea how long the detour takes?" "I'm aware, but I can't risk the liability of people using a bridge that might not be safe." "This is because of the fines, isn't it?" A man behind Brenda spoke up. I recognized him as Tom Hendricks, who lived in one of the larger houses on the far side of the creek. "You're throwing a tantrum over a few $100s. Actually, it's over $1,000 at this point," I said. "But no, this is about safety and property rights. The bridge is mine. I never agreed to maintain public access to it." Brenda's face was turning an alarming shade of purple. "You're going to open that bridge right now or I'll call the police." "Feel free," I said. "I've consulted with a lawyer. I'm well within my rights." She did call the police. 2 officers showed up about an hour later. By then, the crowd on my porch had dispersed, but Brenda was still there, pacing back and forth on my driveway and talking angrily on her phone. The officers were polite and professional. I showed them my property documents and the notice from my lawyer. They looked at the bridge, looked at the paperwork, and then had a quiet conversation with Brenda. I couldn't hear what they said, but I could see her gesturing wildly and pointing at me. Finally, one of the officers came back to talk to me. He was an older guy, probably close to retirement, with tired eyes and a patient demeanor. "Mr. Richardson, I'm Officer Davis. Look, I understand that this is your property and you have the legal right to restrict access. Mrs. Whitmore is pretty upset, though. Is there any way you two can work this out?" "I've tried," I said. "She's been fining me constantly for months over the most ridiculous things. I've paid over $1,000 in bogus violations. I tried to talk to her, tried to attend HOA meetings, but I got stonewalled at every turn. This is the only leverage I have." Officer Davis sighed. "So this is a civil dispute between you and the HOA?" "Yes, sir." "Then there's not much we can do. My advice would be to try mediation or take it to court if you can't resolve it between yourselves. But from a legal standpoint, you're not doing anything wrong by closing access to your own property." He went back and told Brenda the same thing. She argued for a while longer, but eventually the officers left, and she had no choice but to leave too. As she walked away, she turned back to glare at me. "This isn't over," she said. "Not by a long shot." I closed my door and exhaled slowly. Part of me felt triumphant. Another part felt like I just kicked a hornet's nest. The next few days were chaos. My phone was constantly buzzing with calls and messages from angry residents. Most of them I didn't know. A few were sympathetic, understanding that I'd been pushed into this corner. But most were just furious that their commute had suddenly become an hour-and-a-half round trip. I started getting nasty messages on social media. Someone created a Facebook group called Justice for Mountainside Estates that was dedicated to complaining about me. There were over 200 members within the first week. They posted pictures of my house, called me names, speculated about my character and motivations. It was ugly, but I stood firm. The bridge stayed closed. About a week after the closure, I got a certified letter from the HOA's lawyer. It was a demand letter. insisting that I reopen the bridge immediately and threatening legal action if I didn't comply. They claimed that the bridge was an essential access route and that closing it caused undue hardship to the residents. I forwarded the letter to Marcus. He wrote a response laying out my property rights and the expired easement. He also pointed out that any hardship experienced by the residents was due to the HOA's failure to secure a proper easement when they had the chance. The HOA sued me anyway. I wasn't surprised. Brenda wasn't the type to back down, and she'd clearly rallied the residents behind her. The lawsuit claimed that I was acting in bad faith, that I was creating a private nuisance, and that I should be compelled to reopen the bridge. Marcus was confident we'd win, but he warned me that it would take time and that things might get uglier before they got better. He wasn't wrong. In early May, someone spray-painted jerk across my garage door. I had to repaint it myself, which took most of a Saturday. Then my mailbox got knocked over. Twice. I installed a security camera and caught a glimpse of a dark sedan speeding away the second time, but I couldn't make out the license plate. I filed a police report, but there wasn't much they could do without better evidence. Officer Davis came out to take my statement and looked genuinely sorry for me. "Look, Mr. Richardson, I don't agree with vandalism, but you've got to understand that you've made a lot of people very angry. Is there really no way to compromise on this?" "I'm open to compromise," I said. "But Brenda won't even talk to me unless it's through lawyers now. She's the one who escalated this. Have you thought about just opening the bridge and fighting the fines in small claims court? That would take just as long and cost just as much. At least this way I have leverage." Officer Davis shook his head. "Leverage doesn't mean much if your house gets vandalized every week. Just be careful, okay?" I appreciated his concern, but I wasn't backing down. I'd worked too hard for what I had to let a petty HOA tyrant push me around. The lawsuit dragged on through the spring and into the summer. There were depositions, document exchanges, and a lot of back and forth between lawyers. Marcus kept me updated on everything, and he remained confident that we'd prevail. The law was clearly on our side. But Brenda wasn't content to just fight in court. She started a campaign to pressure me in other ways. She got the town zoning board to inspect my property for code violations. They found a few minor things, nothing major, but it was another hassle I had to deal with. She filed a complaint with the state environmental agency, claiming that my workshop was producing hazardous waste. That investigation took weeks and turned up nothing, but it was stressful and time-consuming. She even tried to get my clients to drop me. I found out later that she'd been calling around, telling people that I was difficult to work with and unreliable. It didn't work. Most of my clients knew me well enough to ignore her, but the fact that she tried made my blood boil through all of this. The bridge stayed closed. And as the weeks turned into months, the cracks in the HOA's united front started to show. It started with a few residents reaching out to me privately. They apologized for the hostility, said they understood my position, and asked if there was any way to work things out. I told them all the same thing. I wanted the fines dropped and a written agreement that the HOA would stop harassing me. If they could make that happen, I'd reopen the bridge, but Brenda wouldn't budge. She'd made this personal, and she was determined to win at any cost. By July, the lawsuit was moving toward a hearing. Marcus filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the case was clear-cut and didn't need to go to trial. The HOA opposed it, of course, but their arguments were weak. They couldn't point to any legal basis for compelling me to provide access to my property. The hearing was scheduled for late August, and Marcus was optimistic. But before we got there, something unexpected happened. In mid-August, I was working in my shop when I heard raised voices outside. I walked out to find a small group of residents gathered near the bridge gate. They weren't yelling at me, though. They were yelling at each other. I recognized a few of them. There was Linda Patterson, a retired teacher who lived in one of the smaller homes. Greg and Susan Morales, a young couple with 2 kids. And Tom Hendricks, the guy who'd called me out for throwing a tantrum back in April. They were arguing about money. Apparently, the HOA had levied a special assessment to pay for the lawsuit, and it was substantial. Each household had to pay an extra $1,500 to cover legal fees. A lot of residents were unhappy about it, especially since the lawsuit didn't seem to be going anywhere. Linda saw me watching and broke away from the group to approach me. She looked tired and frustrated. "Mr. Richardson, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course," I said. She glanced back at the others, then lowered her voice. "Look, I know you have your reasons for closing the bridge, and honestly, I don't blame you. Brenda's been on a power trip for years, but this situation is killing us. The detour adds so much time to everyone's day, and now we're all paying through the nose for a lawsuit that we never wanted. Is there really no way to end this?" I felt a pang of sympathy for her. She seemed genuine, and I didn't want to make life harder for people who hadn't done anything to me. "I've told everyone who's asked the same thing," I said. "Drop the fines, agree to stop harassing me, and I'll reopen the bridge. But Brenda won't agree to those terms." "What if we went around her?" Linda asked. "What if we got enough residents together to override her?" I raised an eyebrow. "Can you do that?" "I think so. The HOA bylaws allow for a vote of no confidence if we can get signatures from 60% of the homeowners. We've been talking about it, some of us. We're tired of how she runs things. This bridge situation was just the last straw." That was interesting. "Very interesting. If you can make that happen," I said, "and if the new board agrees to my terms, I'll open the bridge the same day." Linda nodded. "I'll see what I can do." Over the next 2 weeks, I watched from a distance as a quiet rebellion brewed within Mountainside Estates. Linda and a few other residents started circulating a petition to remove Brenda from her position as HOA president. It wasn't easy. Brenda had allies, people who either agreed with her or were too afraid to cross her. But the special assessment had turned a lot of people against her, and the petition slowly gained signatures. Brenda fought back, of course. She sent out emails claiming that the petition was invalid, that the organizers were violating HOA procedures, that removing her would only make things worse. She even tried to call an emergency meeting to address the insurrection, as she called it. But by then, she'd lost too much support. In early September, the petition reached the required threshold. An official vote was scheduled for mid-September, and Brenda was formally removed as HOA president by a vote of 32-8. She was furious, ranting at the meeting about betrayal and ingratitude, but it didn't matter. She was out. The new president was a guy named Richard Sampson, a retired accountant in his 60s who'd always struck me as reasonable and level-headed. One of his first acts was to reach out to me to negotiate a resolution. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Stowe. Richard brought Linda with him as a witness, and I brought Marcus as my lawyer. We talked for about an hour, and by the end of it, we'd hammered out an agreement. The HOA would drop all the fines they'd assessed against me. They'd reimburse me for the legal fees I'd incurred defending against the lawsuit. And they'd agree to a formal policy limiting what violations I could be fined for in the future. All of them reasonable things that I had no problem complying with. In exchange, I'd reopen the bridge and grant the HOA a formal easement for access, free of charge. We shook hands and Marcus drew up the paperwork. Within a week, everything was signed and notarized. On a sunny Saturday morning in late September, I went out to the bridge and removed the gate. A small crowd of residents had gathered to watch, and when the gate came down, there was actual applause. A few people came up to shake my hand and thank me. It felt good. Linda gave me a hug. "Thank you for being patient with us. I'm sorry it took so long to fix this." "It wasn't your fault," I said. "I'm just glad it's over." But it wasn't quite over. Not yet. A few days after the bridge reopened, I got a call from Officer Davis. He asked if I could come down to the police station to answer a few questions. I asked what it was about, and he said he'd rather explain in person. I drove down there with a sense of unease. Marcus met me at the station, just in case. Officer Davis led us into a small interview room and closed the door. "Mr. Richardson, I want to thank you for coming in. I need to ask you some questions about Brenda Whitmore." I frowned. "What about her?" Officer Davis pulled out a folder and opened it. "We've been investigating some financial irregularities with the Mountainside Estates HOA. It appears that Mrs. Whitmore may have been embezzling funds from the association's accounts." I felt my jaw drop. "What?" "The new HOA board requested an audit after Mrs. Whitmore was removed from office. The auditor found significant discrepancies. Over the past 3 years, approximately $80,000 is unaccounted for. The money was withdrawn in small increments, usually a few thousand at a time, and the records were falsified to make it look like legitimate expenses." I sat back in my chair, stunned. "And you think Brenda took it?" "We have bank records showing that many of the withdrawals were made using her access credentials. We're building a case, but we wanted to know if you had any information that might be relevant. Given that you had extensive dealings with her, you might have noticed something unusual." I thought back over the past year. All those fines, the aggressive enforcement, the way she'd escalated everything. Had it all been about the money? "She was always pushing for more fines," I said slowly. "Always finding new violations. I thought she was just on a power trip, but maybe it was more than that. If she was skimming money, maybe she needed to keep the accounts looking active to cover her tracks." Officer Davis nodded. "That's consistent with what we're seeing. The fines generated revenue that made the overall budget look healthy, which helped disguise the missing funds." Marcus leaned forward. "Are you charging her?" "We're working on it. The investigation is ongoing, but it's looking likely." I wanted to give Mr. Richardson a heads up since he's been directly involved in this situation. I left the police station feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. All this time, I'd thought Brenda was just a petty tyrant who enjoyed making people miserable, and maybe she was. But she was also a criminal. The news broke a few weeks later. Brenda Whitmore was arrested and charged with embezzlement and fraud. The story made the local papers, and it was the talk of Stowe for weeks. People were shocked. Some defended her, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was damning. The trial took place the following spring. I was called as a witness to testify about the fines and Brenda's conduct as HOA president. I told the truth, laying out everything that had happened. The prosecution used my testimony as part of a larger pattern, showing how Brenda had abused her position for financial gain. In the end, she was convicted on multiple counts. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA. It was a stunning fall from grace for someone who'd once held so much power in the community. After the trial, life in Mountainside Estates slowly returned to normal. Richard Sampson proved to be an excellent HOA president, fair and transparent. The association implemented new financial controls to prevent future embezzlement, and people stopped treating me like a pariah. I kept working on my furniture projects, enjoying the peace and quiet of my mountain property. The bridge stayed open, and I never had any problems with it. Occasionally, Residents would wave as they drove past, and some even stopped by to chat or commission custom pieces from my workshop. One afternoon in late spring, about a year after the whole ordeal had ended, Linda Patterson stopped by with a homemade pie. She set it on my porch railing and smiled. "I just wanted to say thank you again. If you hadn't stood your ground, we never would have looked closely enough at Brenda to find out what she was doing. You saved the HOA a lot of money and a lot of future headaches." "I was just defending my property," I said, "but I appreciate that." "Well, you did more than that. You showed us that we didn't have to put up with her nonsense. Sometimes it takes one person refusing to back down to make everyone else realize they have power too." After she left, I sat on my porch and looked out at the bridge, the creek, and the mountains beyond. It had been a long, exhausting fight, but it had been worth it. I'd stood up for myself, defended my rights, and in the process, helped an entire community break free from a corrupt leader. The $50 fine that started it all seemed laughably small now. But sometimes the smallest injustices are the ones that matter most, because they're the ones that reveal who people really are and what they're willing to fight for. I cut myself a slice of Linda's pie and savored the quiet afternoon. My steps were properly salted now, whenever it snowed. Not because I feared another fine, but because it was the right thing to do. And the bridge, my bridge, stood strong and open, connecting neighbors who'd learned the hard way that good leadership matters, and that sometimes the most important stand you can take is refusing to be pushed around. The whole experience taught me something valuable about community, about property rights, and about the importance of questioning authority when it oversteps its bounds. Brenda had thought she was untouchable, that she could fine and harass and steal without consequence. She'd been wrong. And as for me, I went back to building furniture, content in the knowledge that sometimes doing the right thing requires doing something that looks petty on the surface. Closing that bridge had seemed like a spiteful move to many people. But it had been the catalyst for real change, the thing that finally forced everyone to confront what had been happening right under their noses. The mountains around Stowe were beautiful that spring, the snow melting into rushing streams, the trees budding with new life. I worked in my shop with the windows open, breathing in the fresh air and listening to the sound of cars crossing my bridge, people going about their lives with one less tyrant to worry about. Justice, I'd learned, doesn't always come quickly or easily. Sometimes you have to force the issue, stand your ground, and weather the storm until the truth comes out. It hadn't been fun, but it had been necessary. And in the end, when I looked back on the whole saga, from that first ridiculous fine about unsalted steps to watching Brenda led away in handcuffs, I felt something like satisfaction. Not because I'd wanted to hurt anyone, but because I'd refused to be a victim, and that refusal had rippled outward, creating change that benefited everyone. Well, everyone except Brenda. But she'd made her choices, just like I'd made mine. The bridge still stands today, a testament to property rights and the importance of standing firm when you're in the right. And every time I cross it, every time I see a neighbor drive past with a friendly wave, I remember that sometimes the best way to help people is to stop letting them take advantage of you. That's the real lesson of mountainside estates. That communities are only as healthy as the people willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it makes you unpopular, even when everyone thinks you're being unreasonable. Because sometimes being unreasonable is the most reasonable thing you can do. The settlement agreement I'd made with Richard and the new HOA board turned out to be one of the best decisions I'd ever made. Not only did it resolve the bridge issue, but it also established me as a respected member of the community rather than an outsider to be pushed around. People started seeing me as someone who'd helped them rather than someone who'd caused problems. My business actually grew after everything settled down. Word spread about my custom furniture work, and I started getting commissions from all over Vermont and even from neighboring New Hampshire. The workshop that Brenda had tried to shut down with her bogus environmental complaints became my livelihood's cornerstone, producing beautiful handcrafted pieces that people were willing to pay premium prices for. I even hired an apprentice, a young guy named David from town who wanted to learn traditional woodworking techniques. Teaching him reminded me why I loved the work in the first place, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional with your own hands. The way wood grain tells a story if you know how to read it. The HOA, under Richard's leadership, became what it should have been all along. A helpful organization focused on maintaining property values and community standards without overreaching or harassing residents. They fixed the roads, organized neighborhood events, and kept the common areas looking nice. Nobody missed Brenda's reign of terror. I did run into her once, about 2 months before her trial. I was at the grocery store in Stowe picking up supplies when I turned a corner and nearly bumped into her. She looked terrible. Her hair was stringy and unkempt, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. She was out on bail, waiting for her court date, and the stress was clearly eating her alive. We stared at each other for a moment. I could see the hatred in her eyes, the blame she was placing on me for her situation. Part of me wanted to say something, to point out that she'd brought this on herself, that if she'd just been reasonable none of this would have happened. But I didn't. What was the point? She'd never accept responsibility for her actions. I just nodded once and walked past her. I heard her mutter something under her breath, but I didn't catch what it was. It didn't matter. She was facing justice, and that was enough. The months between her arrest and trial were tense for a lot of people in mountainside estates. The embezzlement had left the HOA's finances in bad shape, and even with the criminal case promising eventual restitution, there was a real question about whether the association could remain solvent. Richard and the board worked tirelessly to straighten things out, cutting unnecessary expenses and focusing on essential services. They also reached out to residents who'd been excessively fined under Brenda's leadership, offering to review those fines and potentially refund money if the violations had been bogus. I wasn't the only one who'd been targeted. Dozens of residents had been hit with questionable fines over the years, and the refund program helped heal a lot of wounds. The trial itself was a media circus by Stowe's standards. It wasn't every day that a small Vermont town had a major embezzlement case, and reporters from Burlington and even from some regional papers showed up to cover it. I attended most of the trial, partly because I was a witness and partly because I felt like I needed to see it through to the end. Brenda's defense attorney tried to paint her as a dedicated volunteer who'd made some accounting mistakes but hadn't intended to steal anything. It was a weak argument, and the prosecution tore it apart. They showed how she'd systematically siphoned money over years, falsified records, and used her position to intimidate anyone who might question her. They showed bank statements, emails, and testimony from the auditor who'd uncovered the fraud. My testimony came on the 3rd day of the trial. The prosecution asked me to describe my interactions with Brenda, the pattern of fines, and how she'd responded when I challenged her. I told the story as honestly as I could, not embellishing but not downplaying either. The jury listened intently, and I could see several of them shaking their heads as I described some of the more ridiculous violations. On cross-examination, Brenda's attorney tried to make it seem like I was biased, that I had a personal vendetta against her. I didn't take the bait. I didn't have any problem with Mrs. Whitmore until she started fining me unfairly, I said calmly. All I ever wanted was to be left alone to live on my property in peace. She's the one who made this personal. After I stepped down, I sat in the gallery and watched the rest of the trial unfold. Other witnesses testified, including the auditor, several HOA board members, and even some of Brenda's former friends who distanced themselves from her after the allegations came out. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd started small, taking a little here and there, and gradually gotten bolder as she realized no one was watching closely enough to catch her. The defense put Brenda on the stand, which most legal observers thought was a mistake. She was defensive and combative, refusing to take any real responsibility and blaming everyone else for her problems. She claimed the HOA's bookkeeping was disorganized when she took over, that she'd been trying to fix things, that any missing money was due to errors, not theft. The prosecution destroyed her credibility on cross-examination, pointing out specific transactions where she'd written checks to herself, and then deleted them from the books. By the time closing arguments rolled around, it was clear which way the verdict would go. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Brenda's face crumpled when she heard the word guilty repeated over and over. Her attorney put a hand on her shoulder, but she shook it off and stared straight ahead, her expression blank. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge was a stern woman in her 50s named Patricia Rowlands, who had a reputation for being tough but fair. She listened to victim impact statements from several HOA members, including Richard and Linda, who described how Brenda's theft had hurt the community and betrayed the trust people had placed in her. Then Judge Rowlands addressed Brenda directly. "Mrs. Whitmore, you held a position of trust in your community. People elected you to lead their homeowners association, to manage their money, and to look out for their interests. Instead, you stole from them. You used your position to enrich yourself at their expense, and when anyone questioned you, you abused your authority to silence them. This court takes such breaches of trust very seriously." She sentenced Brenda to 4 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after serving at least 2 years. She also ordered full restitution of the $80,000, plus interest and penalties. Given that Brenda had already spent most of the money, and her assets had been seized to partially cover the debt, it was unlikely she'd ever fully pay it back. But the judgment would follow her for the rest of her life. As the bailiff led Brenda away, she turned and looked back at the gallery. Her eyes found mine, and for just a moment, I saw something in her expression. Not remorse exactly, but maybe a glimmer of understanding. She'd pushed too hard, made too many enemies, and now she was paying the price. I didn't feel triumphant watching her go. I felt tired and a little sad. It didn't have to be this way. If she'd just been reasonable, if she'd treated people with basic respect, none of this would have happened. But she'd chosen her path, and now she had to walk it. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around some of the key witnesses. I avoided them, slipping out a side entrance and walking back to where I'd parked my truck. Linda caught up with me halfway there. "Hey," she said, slightly out of breath. "You doing okay?" "Yeah," I said, "just ready for this to be over." "It is over now, finally." She paused. "You know, a bunch of us are getting together at the Mountain Tap tonight to celebrate. You should come." I almost said no. I wasn't much for crowds or celebrations. But then I thought about how isolated I'd felt during the worst of the conflict, and how these people had eventually come around and supported me. Maybe it was time to stop being a hermit and actually be part of the community. "Sure," I said. "I'll be there." The Mountain Tap was packed that night. It seemed like half of Mountainside Estates had shown up, along with a fair number of other Stowe residents who'd followed the case. Richard bought the first round, raising his glass in a toast. "To justice," he said. And to Bradley, who had the guts to stand up when the rest of us were too afraid to. People cheered and clapped, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I wasn't used to being the center of attention, but it felt good being accepted, being part of something. Over the next few hours, I talked with dozens of people. Some apologized for how they'd treated me during the bridge closure. Others shared their own stories of dealing with Brenda's tyranny. One man, an accountant named Paul, told me he'd suspected something was off with the HOA finances years ago, but hadn't pursued it because Brenda had threatened to fine him into oblivion if he made waves. "I should have pushed harder," he said, shaking his head. "Maybe if I had, we could have stopped this sooner. Or maybe she would have just gotten better at hiding it," I said. "You can't blame yourself for her crimes." As the evening wore on and the crowd thinned out, I found myself at a table with Linda, Richard, and a few others, talking about the future of Mountainside Estates. They were optimistic. The community had been through hell, but they'd come out stronger. They'd learned to question authority, to demand transparency, and to stand together when it mattered. "The bridge thing really was the turning point," Richard said, sipping his beer. "When you closed it, it forced everyone to confront what was happening. We couldn't just ignore Brenda's behavior anymore because it was literally affecting our daily lives." "I didn't do it to be noble," I said. "I did it because I was angry and wanted leverage." "Doesn't matter why you did it," Linda said. "What matters is that it worked. You showed us that we had power too, that we didn't have to just accept whatever Brenda dished out." I drove home that night feeling lighter than I had in months. The ordeal was truly over. Brenda was going to prison, the HOA was on solid footing, and I had my peace back. More than that, I had something I hadn't expected. A place in the community, real friendships, and the respect of my neighbors. The seasons turned, and life went on. Summer gave way to fall and fall to winter. I salted my steps religiously whenever it snowed, more out of habit now than anything else. The bridge stood strong, carrying traffic back and forth as it was always meant to. I got a letter from Brenda once, about 6 months into her prison sentence. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. She'd written it in neat, careful handwriting, filling 2 pages front and back. Most of it was self-justification and excuses. She claimed she'd been under financial stress, that her husband's medical bills had forced her to make bad choices, that the HOA had left her no support and too much responsibility. She never actually said the words, "I'm sorry," or admitted she'd been wrong to steal. But at the end, in a postscript that seemed almost like an afterthought, she wrote, "You were right about the fines. I went too far. I thought I could control everything, but I couldn't control you. Maybe that's why I hated you so much." I read that line several times, then folded the letter and put it in a drawer. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, and the closest thing to self-awareness she'd probably ever show. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. 2 years passed. I heard through the grapevine that Brenda had been released on parole after serving her minimum sentence. She moved away from Vermont, supposedly to live with family in Ohio. I never saw her again, and I was fine with that. Some chapters of your life are better left closed. Mountainside Estates thrived under new leadership. Richard served 2 terms as president before stepping down and handing the reins to someone else. The association's finances stabilized, then actually improved as better management and fair enforcement of reasonable rules, encouraged more people to move into the development. Property values went up, not because of aggressive HOA enforcement, but because it was genuinely a nice place to live. My furniture business continued to grow. I took on a second apprentice, a young woman named Sarah who had an incredible eye for design. Together, we created pieces that were featured in several Vermont lifestyle magazines. I even got commissioned to create furniture for a new boutique hotel in Burlington, which was both challenging and incredibly rewarding. The bridge, my bridge, became something of a local legend. People would drive past and point it out, telling the story of the HOA president who went too far and the homeowner who stood his ground. The details got exaggerated over time, as stories do, but the core truth remained. That property rights matter, that standing up to bullies is important, and that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can lead to the biggest changes. I never regretted closing that bridge, even though it caused so much chaos and anger at the time. It was the right move, the necessary move, and it led to justice not just for me, but for an entire community that had been suffering under corrupt leadership for years. On quiet evenings, I sometimes walked out to the bridge and stood there, looking at the creek flowing beneath it and the mountains rising in the distance. I thought about how far I'd come, from that first $50 fine for unsalted steps to watching Brenda get sentenced for embezzlement. It had been a wild ride, full of stress and anger and uncertainty, but it had also been worth it. Because in the end, I'd learned something important about myself, that I could stand up for what was right, even when it was hard, even when everyone was against me, even when the easier path would have been to just pay the fines and keep my head down. I'd learned that I had courage I didn't know I possessed, and that lesson was more valuable than any bridge or any amount of money. The people of Mountainside Estates had learned something too. They'd learned to be vigilant, to ask questions, to demand accountability from their leaders. They'd learned that communities are strongest when everyone has a voice, not just the person with the most authority. And they'd learned that sometimes the person everyone thinks is being unreasonable is actually the only one seeing clearly. As for the bridge itself, it remained open and well maintained. The HOA honored our easement agreement and I kept my end of the bargain. No more games, no more conflicts, just neighbors helping neighbors and respecting each other's rights. It was how things should have been from the beginning. 3 years after Brenda's conviction, Richard stopped by my workshop one afternoon with an interesting proposition. The HOA wanted to put up a small plaque near the bridge, commemorating its history and acknowledging its importance to the community. They wanted my permission since it was still technically my property. What would the plaque say? I asked, curious. Richard pulled out a piece of paper with a mock-up. It read, Richardson Bridge, built 2004. A reminder that community is built on respect, fairness, and the courage to stand for what's right. I looked at the mock-up for a long moment, then smiled. I like it, but let's just call it Rocky Creek Bridge. This isn't about me. It kind of is, though, Richard said. You're part of the history now, whether you like it or not. We compromised. The plaque went up with the name Rocky Creek Bridge, but it included a small note about the importance of property rights and community accountability. It was subtle enough not to embarrass me, but clear enough that anyone who knew the story would understand the reference. The plaque unveiling became a small community event. People brought food and drinks, kids played in the creek, and someone even brought a local band to play music. It was one of those perfect Vermont autumn days, with the leaves turning gold and red and the air crisp and clean. During the event, several people came up to thank me again, even though it had been years since the whole ordeal. I realized that what had happened had become part of the community's identity, a shared experience that had shaped who they were and how they governed themselves. It was humbling to be part of that, even if I'd never set out to be anyone's hero. As the sun started to set and people began packing up to leave, Linda came over with a tired but happy smile on her face. "You know what the best part of all this is?" she said. "What's that? We're actually a community now. Before, we were just people who happened to live near each other. But going through that whole mess together, fighting to make things right, it brought us together in a way nothing else could have. So thank you for that, even if it wasn't what you intended." I looked around at the families laughing together, the neighbors chatting like old friends, the kids playing without a care in the world. She was right. Something good had come from all the chaos and conflict, something real and lasting. "You're welcome," I said. "Though honestly, you all did the hard part. I just closed a bridge." Linda laughed. "You're too modest, Bradley, but I'll let you have that one." As I drove home that evening, past the newly christened Rocky Creek Bridge with its modest plaque, I felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had thrown me a curveball when I bought this property, with its complicated HOA situation and its vindictive president. But I'd handled it, stood my ground, and come out the other side not just unscathed, but actually better off. The mountains around Stowe were beautiful as always, timeless and steady. I'd found my place among them, earned my spot in this community through conflict and resolution. And while I wouldn't wish another HOA battle on anyone, I also wouldn't trade the experience for anything. Because sometimes you don't choose your battles. Sometimes they choose you. And when that happens, all you can do is stand your ground, fight fair, and hope that justice prevails in the end. In my case, it did, and that made all the difference. The workshop light was on when I pulled into my driveway, which meant David had stayed late to finish a project. I smiled, thinking about how much he'd grown as a craftsman over the past few years. He'd probably be ready to start his own business soon, and I'd be proud to recommend him to clients. I parked the truck and walked toward the workshop, ready to see what he'd been working on. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new challenges, new opportunities. But tonight, I was content to be exactly where I was, in a place I'd fought to call home, surrounded by a community I'd accidentally helped save. The bridge stood behind me in the gathering darkness, solid and dependable, carrying people where they needed to go. And that, I thought, was a pretty good metaphor for life. Sometimes you have to close the path to make people see its value. Sometimes you have to stand alone before others will stand with you. And sometimes the smallest act of defiance can change everything. My steps were salted, my property was mine, and justice had been served. What more could a man ask for?